So I wasn't going to make a video about this Sony a7 IV firmware update, but there are a few things that we really actually need to discuss about firmwares in general, but also some of the key features in this firmware update might actually suit your workflow. But the timestamps will be below because, bear with me, there's a few things that we need to discuss first before we actually get into the firmware updates. And if you do want to skip that, perfectly fine, skip to the firmware update information. So I guess the biggest reason why I didn't want to make this is for the fact that the Sony FX6 firmware update, the FX3 and FX30 and the A7R5 firmware updates, they actually failed. They essentially pulled the firmware updates off the website because a lot of people were actually having issues with their cameras. The FX6, there was something wrong with the top handle and the audio going directly in there, so they pulled that firmware update. They've obviously reintroduced it now. And same thing with the A7R5. I think there was an audio issue. The FX30 and FX3, some people were having issues as well. And this is actually quite concerning. You know, Sony actually realizing that there are issues, so they pull the firmware updates off the website and then reintroduce them. And that just leads me to the fact that why do we actually want to upgrade our cameras? Because they're completely going to brick our cameras if there's an issue, or not even just brick it, but there could be an issue coming from these firmware updates that we're actually putting into our camera. It's almost like we're literally giving our camera a virus and then saying, hey, you can completely wreck us, or you know, it'd be perfectly fine. We won't even notice any difference. And that's quite concerning, and it is actually worrying. Now, when it comes to all the firmware updates that I've done with all my Sony cameras, I've had zero issues, and I am very fortunate, I guess. I don't know if it's because I am doing the protocols correctly, which we'll actually discuss later on as well, the correct procedure in how to actually do the Sony firmware updates. But, you know, some people are just updating too fast. They're going from, let's say, version 1 all the way to version 5, when you're meant to go version 1 to version 2 to version 3, then to version 4. You're actually meant to do each firmware update. And, I mean, look, in all honesty, that kind of sucks. And you want to try and make these firmware updates as foolproof as possible. So, you know, people don't forget. You know, we all make mistakes and accidentally, you know, do the wrong thing. Like even with this firmware update, I was on version 2, and then this new firmware update is version 4. So I actually downloaded the version 4 and then put it onto the Type A card, put it into my a7 IV, and I was like, hang on a minute, I don't think I'm actually on the correct firmware update yet. So I had to delete it off my PC, download version 3, update that first, and then re-download version 4 and then update that into the a7 IV. That is the correct procedure. And I don't know what would happen if I actually went from version 2 to version 4. Like, would that brick my camera? It's very stressful, considering that, you know, we could be full-time freelancers for photographers or videographers, and we need these tools. And it is quite annoying when you actually see these firmware updates get pulled but then reintroduced, and it's just like, well, what about all the people that have actually updated their firmware first? What happens? Like, is their camera going to completely cark it? Is it going to be perfectly fine? It's stressful. It really is stressful. And it wasn't too bad for me because I've had zero issues, but when you start hearing horror stories and you're like, do I want to update my firmware? And I guess that's probably one of the reasons why I didn't have the current firmware in the a7 IV. It's because I just didn't really want to update it. The camera was working perfectly fine. There was no bugs. And I just didn't want to update it because I didn't want there to be any issues, because the a7 IV literally is my daily driver. It does all these YouTube videos, it does a lot of Instagram videos, and obviously social media stuff that I have to do for freelance stuff. So I don't really want it to completely die on me. Like I said, I do have other cameras, but still, this is a fantastic camera and I don't want the firmware to ruin my camera. And I guess Sony is at that point where, I don't know, the trust has kind of been broken and they really need to regain that trust back. Like, sure, that's amazing. They're giving us firmware updates, that's great. But just don't ruin our cameras. Like, test it on 100, 200, 300 cameras before you actually release it out to the world. I don't know what their testing protocol is and how many cameras they actually test this on. And I just don't want to see any of these issues out in the wild, like of cameras getting bricked. It really is stressful, and I don't want to have to make these firmware update videos and be like, hey, update your firmware, and then it's bricked someone's camera. I feel kind of partially responsible for spreading the news of this, firmware update, and it's bricked someone's camera. So look, rant over. Sony do recommend you update each time. But whether you update each time is personally up to you and at your own risk. I guess that's kind of the disclaimer that we all have to give. And I will be the testing guinea pig. And if I do have issues, I will definitely be making a video about it. But so far, so good for me. Fingers crossed, touch wood. It's been perfectly fine. But let's get into the firmware update. So look, when it comes to this firmware update, there isn't really much that is kind of useful in a lot of my situations. Like there's a whole bunch of different things that they've actually added into this, but for me, I just don't really see too much of a use. The one thing that I have seen a lot of use is the monitor and control app. Now, I've never used the monitor and control app, and I know a lot of people rave about it, but holy damn. It is amazing. It's pretty much one of those apps that you could almost use your mobile phone as the monitoring device. Like you probably don't actually need an external monitor. And just a lot of the tools and features that you would generally see on a regular monitor, like anamorphic modes, waveforms, histograms, false color. But this is great because you can actually adjust, your ISO, you can adjust your shutter, iris, autofocus settings. And I think one of the most impressive things when it comes to just a wireless connection, that the latency is actually quite low. It does seem like you could potentially pull focus off this and it being very accurate. It really doesn't have too much latency. And I do feel like it's very similar to like a standard monitor. There's always going to be latency through HDMI or SDI. Really just depends on what cords you're using, what monitor you're using, and also what camera you're using as well. Just for the workflow and the ergonomic design of just having no wires attached to your camera, but you're still getting really low latency monitoring, that's pretty amazing. So look, overall, it's up to you if you want to update your camera. Like I said at the start, it's just really hard to trust Sony at this point in time when it comes to firmware updates, because we don't know if this is going to hurt people's cameras. But make it foolproof, make it the easiest way possible. I don't know, potentially make future cameras that you don't have to update from 1 to 2 to 3 to get to 4. You could just go straight from 1 to 4 and it not completely ruin your camera. Maybe try that. I don't know if that's a thing. I'm not a software engineer. I don't know if this is physically possible, but make it possible. Make it the easiest way that you can update your camera. I don't know how it is, but that would be great. And I really just hope this video was useful. And yeah, that's it from me. I'll see you guys the next time. Let's get it.